The tale of the Crimson Slaughter is a tragic one. To the Imperium, it is the story of ultimate betrayal, a Space Marine chapter that turned from the light of the Emperor, rebels who forsook sacred duty to pursue their own twisted agenda. As for the Crimson Slaughter themselves, their beliefs are more varied. Some claim it was nothing more than random fate, a series of events that led down a path upon which there could be no turning back. Others deny any aimlessness in their doom, seeing instead engineered machinations of more sinister forces, or perhaps their chapter's own subconscious bursting forth after long and brutal suppression. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and this is 40k Stories. The renegades who call themselves the Crimson Slaughter were once the Crimson Sabers chapter of Space Marines. Since their betrayal and excommunication, many have sought out their origins. Thus far, the Inquisition has failed to reveal any conclusive evidence that links them to corrupt gene seed or known mutagenic factors. It is unknown from which founding they were created, or which chapter served as their progenitor. Naturally, much speculation has been made, including postulations from the chapter itself. The earliest mentions of the Crimson Sabers that have been covered are battle records that list them at the dawn of the 36th millennium. That the chapter's founding is unknown seems tied to two events, the Amalgamation Schism and the destruction of the planet Rogan. To most bureaucratic systems, those with the most Adeptus Administratum workers keep the best records, but ironically, they're the most difficult to extract any information from. The sheer number of data scrolls and information stockpiles, along with outdated or misunderstood technology, makes sitting the heat recordings the life's work of entire armies of scribes. This is why it is so hard for the Imperium and the Inquisition to find out anything about this chapter. After long searches, keen-eyed inquisitorial teams have been able to track down several sources regarding the chapter's activity during the Wars of Apostasy, during the betrayal of the High Lord of Terror, Goj Vandaya. One, a brief report in the chronologues of the Silver Skulls, lists their service and fire support as exemplary. To aid this, prognosticators delved further, confirming that they were judged to be in perfect accordance to the Codex Astartes. This may suggest they were Ultramarines' successor chapter, but this is unconfirmed. Another reference comes from the Black Templars, crediting them as the leaders in hunting down and destroying a Xenos threat that encroached upon Segmentum Solar whilst the Imperium was distracted with the war with Vandaya. During the cleansing of Danor IV, a year-long campaign in which no less than 6 chapters took part, the Crimson Sabers gained the most commendations. The overall leader, the chapter master of the Blood Angels at the time, Commander Virgilus, noted that their duty-bound Crimson Sabers were masters of quick-strike warfare, praising their drop pod assaults and claiming that they nearly rivaled the Blood Angels. The only cautionary note from this period comes from Brother Erigulus, an Ultramarines librarian who was also on Danor IV. It was his report that cited them as over-eager for acceptance. Later, he went on to clarify that this overwrought zeal might have been expected from a new chapter fighting alongside such Imperial legends as the Blood Angels and Ultramarines. This, however, is a slight foreshadow of what was to follow. The following story details the Amalgamation Schism. Although the warp storms that once cut it off had lifted, the Krakatoa system remained plagued by strange eddies in the Materium. This made warp transit in its vicinity particularly hazardous. Aside from going off course, spacecraft faced increased risk of time alterations and demonic incursion. Despite this, many ships were still caught in the wayward crosscurrents. So many derelict spacecraft and warp anomalies materialized just outside of Krakatoa, the region became known colloquially as Hulk Alley. From Rogan, the home planet of the Crimson Sabers, they routinely launched missions to explore these hulks, the fleet blasting paths through debris and using the larger clusters for target practice. Indeed, one of the few records that have been found in the archives of Terra compounds this, claiming that the location of the chapter's home world was specifically chosen so that they could regularly perform this precautionary duty. Even before the Space Hulk designated Amalgamation fully emerged from the warp, psychic choirs in the system began receiving desperate pleas for help. Other comm channels followed as the process solidifying into real space took place. What appeared was a Hulk in every sense of the word, an enormous conglomerate made of a miserable mangle of many starfaring craft compacted together. At the heart was a pilgrimage transport, a barricaded vessel where many millions of colonists were under siege by warp entities. All available elements of the Crimson Sabers were called up, but they were not alone. Following some trail of their own, the Dark Angels arrived shortly after and requested to enter alone. This appeal was dropped after the arrival of the Blood Angels, which had also answered the signal. Having the most senior officer present, the Blood Angels claimed overall command, but even as they did so, the Crimson Sabers followed their own protocols and launched boarding torpedoes towards the Hulk. Soon, the other forces joined by Thunderhawk Landing, while Deathwing Terminators teleported directly. The Space Marines carved through bulkheads to enter blood-strewn corridors. Just as they announced contact with the foe, the demons began to fade, disappearing into the warp. The military aspect was over, and so the Space Marines made ready to return to their respective ships, leaving the surviving colonists to the Inquisition. In their zeal, the Crimson Sabers had not deferred to two of the most heralded chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Although the two organizations couldn't be more different from one another, the taciturn and simple-robed Dark Angels contrasting with the polished brilliance of the Blood Angels, both chapters were proud and well aware of their status. Tradition, unspoken though it was, had been breached, and the Crimson Sabers were treated coldly as impudent newcomers rather than brothers in arms. And there was further trouble besides. Against procedure, a chaplain had captured one of the colonists. The chaplain had been in the midst of harsh interrogations when several squads of Sabers interrupted his work. They challenged him, claiming that some warp malady must have possessed the Dark Angel for him to do so, and a brief firefight ensued. This resulted in casualties among both chapters, and the subsequent escape of the hostage. Clearly infuriated, it seemed the Dark Angels were on the verge of retaliation, but they soon disappeared with the arrival of the Inquisitors. And this created a growing estrangement. Even a small thing can cause many ripples like a stone dropped in a pond. Although outwardly everything was the same, the event came to be known as the Amalgamation Schism. It set off a chain of events that was to have wider repercussions. Within days, the Crimson Saber stronghold of Decavitum received word of Sentia from Terra, and most probably from their founding chapter as well, although no records remain of who that actually was. This was little more than remonstrance, a lesser rebuke that let it be known that you don't mess with the Dark Angels and Blood Angels, and had brought them dishonor. The leaders of the Crimson Sabers, their high council of company masters and senior officers, ordered a tribunal. None wished the deeds to be questioned, and Chapter Master Nigellus was alarmed to learn that some of the group feared to be censured further. Concerned with what he felt was a growing element of unwarranted paranoia, he was very outraged. To his mind, he felt the Crimson Sabers had followed procedure, acted swiftly and correctly in responding to the threat. If there was any misconduct, it was not by his chapter. Furthermore, any perceived slight to honor was unintentional and petty. They were all serving the same emperor, were they not? He was determined to shed his chapter's self-doubt and make a statement. In a bold move, he declared the Sabers would sever all ties to their brother Space Marines, including their founders. They would be loyal to the Codex Astartes and follow uncompromisingly all orders as issued by the High Lords of Terra. To all others, they were unanswerable. By his straightforward logic, this was as it should be. Their mission of service was not to be corrupted by the influence of their comrades. Was it not faithfulness to the War Master Horus that allowed half the original legions to be led astray? In this action, he sought to free the Sabers from faulty judgment, and therefore all reproach. At first, they maintained great pride in their resolve, but slowly, doubt began to gnaw away at them again. Never one to brook dissent, Nigellus banned all further debate on the matter, and any mention of the Amalgamation Schism was forbidden. The Sabers remained resolute in their convictions, but the break with their primogenitors was far from easy. Much of their chapter lore had to be reconfigured so that no mention of their founders appeared in their history. Over and over, the librarians and chaplains were ordered to scrub clean all evidence of their forebears, and Rogan was scoured of statues, heirloom suits of power armor, and any relics of the ancient past that predated the founding of the chapter. Amongst the starfaring fleet, strike crews were renamed, and the training regiment of the 10th Company was reconstructed. In essence, the Crimson Sabers were reborn. This is why it is very hard to find any mention of who they were formerly, who their primogenitor chapter was. They wiped it clean. They wanted to be new and separate. Only in one place, the innermost chambers of the tallest tower of Decavitum, their chapter stronghold, was the full history locked away. There it was decreed that the truth of their birthright and the full history of their deeds would be kept. The sanctum was accessible to only the senior officers of the chapter, the captains, senior chaplains, and librarians. Beneath the stern leadership of Nigellus, the Crimson Sabers were zealous in their duty. If any rumour or ill feeling remained amongst any agents of the Adeptus Terra, this was forgotten very quickly. The Red Armour Space Marines firmly established a reputation for swift efficiency, being regarded as warriors of unimpeachable conduct. Indeed, their rigorous obedience to the Codex Astartes, for they followed its guidelines to the letter, earned them many commendations. However, deeper within the chapter, something was brooding. Nigellus served as chapter master for over 100 years. He was uncompromising, and he knew well the tenets of the Codex Astartes and followed them perfectly. In pursuing faultlessness, he instilled a new cult of extreme rigor within the Crimson Sabers. It was not enough for each mission to be successful, it had to be faultless. properly detailed and recorded. It was a great loss when he was slain during the Fonstant Rebellion. Arnok succeeded him as the chapter master, but the new traditions lived on. If anything, the chapter became yet more fervent in exacting strict adherence to orders. Arnok became known as the Intransigent, a title that would be used to describe all chapter masters that followed. In one of his first acts, he sought to further banish their hidden past, wary of how others might judge the chapter. He made the decision to seal all entrances to the Sanctum of the Sword, where the chapter's history would be kept. Not only did it lock away any evidence of imperfection, but it was also his declaration that the past was completely over. A new era had begun. More eager than ever to prove themselves, they conducted operations with undeniable precision. Over many centuries, their battle records were exemplary. They gained particular distinction in the Zobrist Wars, hunting down Eldar, and also drew many commendations during the Dead Star battles. In both cases, their allies, who included many battalions and armoured division of Talon along with the Black Templars, are noted in official documentation as praising them. Off the record, the truth was rather different. The Crimson Sabers were efficient and trustworthy, yet when the battle was over they were self-righteous and fastidious. Allied commanders, whether subordinates or many ranks more senior, received both battle reports of great detail. This inevitably pointed out where Allied forces had failed to meet proper standards. For Space Marines, any deviation from the Codex Astartes brought even longer data scrolls, long lists of observed compliances that failed to follow the tactical or organizational guidelines set forth by Robert Guilliman. While the demands for meticulous detail, contingency plans, and exact protocol ultimately helped, it also estranged the Crimson Sabers from those they fought with. All their previous conflicts, however, were precursors to the chapter's role in the Redemption Crusades. The Age of Redemption was marked by crusades, countless campaigns launched in an effort to purge away the age of apostasy sins. Once again, the ecclesiarchy rebuilt, and wave after wave of new offences were announced. This was an ideal time for an eager chapter to prove themselves. Seeking a lion's share of glory, the Crimson Sabers campaigned with utmost diligence, striving to further perfect their rapid strikes. With ruthless efficiency, they completed mission after mission, crusades in which they took part expanding the holdings of Segmentum Tempestus. On planet after planet, they crippled key enemy infrastructure or seized heavily fortified positions, allowing waves of Imperial Guard to consolidate and hold all gains. It was the Crimson Sabers that eradicated the Hrud from the frontier world of Nola, and led the way to free the Reductus system from the Orcs. Despite the heroics and their instances of sacrifice, Chapter Master Drabek, who was Chapter Master at the time, became increasingly convinced that the reputation was called into question. To those on Terra, this was not the case, for the Crimson Sabers were among the most highly decorated forces that participated in Segmentum Tempestus. To those who fought alongside them, though, this assessment was absolutely spot on. Many allies were growing frustrated with the highly critical and overly suspicious nature of the Crimson Sabers. During the Redemption Crusades, many long-lost worlds and star systems were added to the Imperium's control. In their fervour for longer, more involved campaigns, the Imperium sustained many casualties and became stretched too thin once again. The galaxy is dangerous, and it hates power vacuums. While the Imperium concentrated its efforts to expand, the inadequately defended home sectors became imperiled. Throughout the galaxy, rebellions, chaos-led insurgencies, orc invasions, and new Xenos threats encroached upon poorly defended worlds. Whilst the Crimson Sabers were in the Veiled region, the collapse of the Krakatoa system, their home system, began. The distant fleets of the Crimson Sabers soon received word from their besieged fortress monastery, but they could not leave until their campaign had been properly concluded. By the time they completed everything, the incursion of Krakatoa was all but over. The shield world of Rogan, their homeworld, had been the first to fall to the demonic onslaught. Subsequent explosions of the planet's reactors, relics of the Dark Age of technology, left the planet a blasted rad zone, uninhabitable for thousands of years. When the massed uprising and demonic fury descended, the only help came in the form of cyclonic torpedoes, exterminatus. 3 worlds were seething with corruption. There was little choice but to condemn them to fiery destruction. In the wake of this purge, a plague scoured Rin's End. Of the once thriving system, only Ramdon and Drosh remained. The devastation of their system and loss of their homeworld hit the Sabers hard. The last transition for the Psychic Choirs revealed an ugly picture, their fortress partially overrun, its occupants cruelly tortured. While they would soon settle on Drosh, the third world of the Krakatoa system, the loss of Rogan was a blow to their pride. All records of their past and the truth of their origins had been lost, buried beneath their ruined stronghold. Although they had turned from their past, some had actually held out a hope that their estranged founding fathers would one day re-establish ties. No chapter ever did. It took many years for the chaplain for the chapter to re-establish itself and to rebuild its numbers. During this time, they did not fail in their duty, nor did they slacken their zeal, but a simmering resentment was also growing. For over 1,000 years after resettling, the Crimson Sabers continued their duty. All Space Marines had attached, but the zealously obedient Sabers drifted into even greater isolation. They didn't even realize the growing acrimony they themselves fostered among their comrades. In others, they saw only flaws, and they were puzzled that their own quest for absolute adherence to the Codex gained them little commendation. By the time they made the planetfall that forever changed their chapter, they had earned a reputation as self-righteous crusaders. And you thought the Black Templars were bad. Several Space Marine chapters heard the distress calls sent out from the jungle world of Umidia. When it was discovered the Crimson Sabers were en route, the other nearby chapters withdrew their offers of aid. Had any of them sent along a landing detail to aid out the operation, perhaps matters may have turned out differently. Following standard procedure, reconnaissance by the Crimson Sabers recorded a surprising development. Escalating calls for support eventually summoned all available warriors from the entire chapter onto the planet. With each new location they scanned, they found more corruption, so that it was not long before they went from localized assault to genocidal cleansing. In their methodical manner, they purged Umidia, seeking nothing less than to eliminate every single one of the world's inhabitants. Much later, when questioned, members of the Crimson Sabers claimed that all of Umidia's citizenry were given over to Belthu cults, a debased group that worshipped the dark gods. In the wake of the purge, inquisitorial teams from the Order Hereticus were sent to investigate. They found no evidence that the Belthu cults were worshippers of the dark gods. What they did find was an atrocity. With the duty of rooting out nests of corrupted cells, the Order Hereticus was composed of hardened individuals. Each of their order had seen many a grim scene, yet each expressed horror at what they witnessed upon Umidia. The Crimson Sabers' action went well beyond the eradication of some hidden cult. It had been an act of wanton butchery on a planetary scale. The Crimson Sabers had left long before the Inquisition arrived. However, the slaughter they had wrought was already beginning to have a strange effect. At first, none of them mentioned any of their untoward experiences, each feeling as if perhaps he was simply having some sort of post-battle melancholia. Many felt unusual symptoms, multiple hearts racing to peak levels for no reason, or the onset of a growing sense of foreboding, as if some unseen fog was closing in all around them. Actually, that's a typo, that should probably be fog. A rising pressure weighed heavily upon their minds. Even before the mission was fully complete and the Sabers returned to their fleet, some of the members were already feeling the first effects of what they would later call the haunting. Individual members of the chapter found they could not properly clear their minds. No amount of litanies or meditation seemed to work. Thanks to implants and genetic modification, Space Marines don't sleep, as most humans would call it anyway, for they enter a comatose state that allows them to recharge even while their bodies remain alert. Yet the Crimson Sabers failed in attempt after attempt to reach that state. Rather than being able to relax, they visualized instead the face of those they had killed, living that massacre over and over again. In an ever-growing state of unrest, the most agitated began to hear voices, the whispered words of the slain. The voices cajoled, taunted, or pleaded, while others screamed endlessly or chanted indecipherable words that were painful to hear. No Space Marines yet broke, for through training and superhuman discipline their willpower was as impervious as their power armor. However, as the fleet entered the warp, traveling towards their next destination, many felt their sanity slipping away. Hidden from their comrades, they clutched their hands to their heads in a futile effort to stop the voices. Since he had watched the slaughter unfold, Chapter Master Sevastus Cranon too felt a growing unease. The Crimson Sabers were of course only following procedure. The Imperials' response to heretics was necessarily harsh, but something felt very wrong. For a brief time, Sevastus Cranon hung on a knife edge. Part of him wanted to stop the fleet, return to Umidia. It was getting harder to think clearly, as every voice in his head was accusing him of atrocities, and visions of condemnation flashed through his thoughts. He knew he had shown the proper methodology, that behind his acts was orthodox procedure, but another part of him felt a growing dread, that he and his troops were cursed somehow. It could be hidden no longer, for it had become apparent during warp travel that they were hearing voices of the slain. On their homeworld, as on a great many planets of the Imperium, witches, mutants, and madmen were hunted down and slain for lesser signs of insanity than those he and his chapter were now displaying. Despite the voices that attempt to alter his perception, he at last came to a decision. They would halt their warp travel and return to Umidia, setting their course instead, though, for her sister planet, Demetra. There they would seek clues of contamination. If, as he suspected, they uncovered further spread of the chaos-worshipping Belthu cults, he could offer them up as proof of the righteousness of their cause. It also gave the chaplains, librarians, and apothecaries some time to assess the mental malady. The voyage to leap warp space and reach orbit over Demetra was brief, but to the Crimson Sabers it felt like a lifetime of torment. No peace could be found on the fleet, and paranoid insanity raced through each and all members of the chapter. It was not the Crimson Sabers that made planetfall, but raving madmen. In an instinctive attempt to burn away the harrowing memories, the red armored space marines arrived forgetful of all plans, now intent on a single undertaking: slaughter. Using the rapid strike multiple assault blueprint that had made the Adeptus Astartes the most feared fighting force, they sliced into Demetra's population centers like a power sword through flesh. Systematically, they employed a combined arms approach that utilized armor, sudden strikes, and bold maneuver to eliminate all living targets. Herding all before them, they set up spectacular orbital bombardments and finished the rest off with bolter fire or pulverizing them in close combat. They killed with an efficiency that only superhumans genetically modified expressly for war could achieve. Gore-drenched, they returned to their fleet, haunted no longer. They had drowned the voices in their heads with tidal waves of blood. Upon closing their eyes, they could find only the peace of restful oblivion. In typical detailed fashion, Cranon filed his after-action report. He declared the neighbouring world was indeed tainted, undoubtedly due to its proximity to Humidia. The threat was destroyed, and the Crimson Sabers were now moving on to their next mission. After the massacre upon Demetra, librarians brought Chapter Master Sevastus Cranon messages intercepted from the High Lords of Terror. It was his worst fears confirmed. The Crimson Sabers had been declared excommunicate traitores. They were now named as renegades, a standing order for all forces of the Imperium to open fire on sight. Part of Cranon had known such a move was possible, but he'd expected an inquiry, not excommunication. If he could only explain, the acts had been extreme, but necessary. Even as he thought this, he envisioned the faces of those they had massacred, and in a voice, perhaps his own, whispered that the Crimson Sabers' only hope had been the Imperial bureaucracy overlooking the incidents. Deep down, Cranon knew he could never satisfactorily explain the violence that had overcome his chapter, or the voices that followed. Inevitably, the ecclesiarchy would brand them as traitors and demon worshippers. Now every asset of the galaxy's greatest empire would be turned against them. He was not prepared for the crushing finality of it. Given their location, Cranon knew they would never reach Dross before the Imperial forces could. He debated not sending a warning to them. Exterminatus would be faster and more merciful than the cruelty that would doubtless descend upon those that remained within their monastery. Countless serfs, half-trained scouts, and more would be put to death. Cranon thought of the old veterans hardwired into the defense guns and the scout sergeant with whom he had long served. Violent death was expected for a space marine, but all had hoped to fall in battle. There was no honor dying to a cyclonic torpedo. He had vowed to do all he could to ensure the best for his chapter. Now, like a weight lifted from his shoulders, he realized he no longer owed anyone anything. Yet he could not be wholly sure if this was his own thought or the return of the hated voices. He felt like he could hear them scratching like his subconscious already. Regardless of right or wrong, service was ingrained, a part of his fibre. Calling for librarians, he dictated an urgent message to Drosh. In essence, it read, "Run if you can. To remain on the planet or the old moon base of Rogan, or to be affiliated with any way in the chapter, was a death sentence. Whether they escaped or not, he never knew. Bereft of sanctuary, they would be hunted without mercy." After sending his message, he called a sword meet, a gathering of the chapter. In the great hall of the vast flagship Red Honor they gathered, rank after rank of battle brothers, bonded by vows and wars uncounted. All looked up to Cranon, for they hoped to hear words of salvation even as the voices began to once more echo inside of their heads. Cranon spoke of the physical pain they had endured. He spoke of their commitment. He spoke of their honor and of the warp-born curse that allowed voices to whisper in their mind. And finally, he spoke of the choice before them. Only through battle and death could the Crimson Sabers rid themselves of the voices that haunted them. It was his plan to steer a course into the Eye of Terror. There they could attack the hell-spawn traitors within that forsaken region, and no further innocent lives would be lost. They may be branded traitors, but he knew they were not. It would be a noble end, a martyrdom fitting for heroes as in the tales of old. Any that wished to leave could leave now. Beneath the great vaulted domes there was silence as each Space Marine pondered his ultimate fate. With a resounding cry, the Crimson Sabers shouted as one, raising their arms in the chapter salute. They would follow Cranon. They would remain in service to the Emperor. They would join him for one final campaign, even if that were to be a last defiant charge into the very heart of their enemy's realm. Bowing his head, he felt pride swelling inside him. Cranon dispersed his charges back to their ships and bade them all set course for the Eye. Even as he did, there was some other part, an almost unconscious, lingering voice that said he was not leading his men to martyrdom, but luring them. Some other fate awaited them, something far greater than an unmourned death. All warp journeys are prone to anomalies, and the nearer a vessel gets to the greatest tear in the fabric of real space that is the Eye of Terror, the more they feel the presence of the Immaterium getting on their heads. With the frequent travels through warp space, all Space Marines have mantras or hymnals that allow them to maintain solid mental discipline. For the Crimson Sabers, these intonations were compromised. The swelling voices and whispers left them vulnerable, their iron wills besieged by self-doubt. By the time they dropped out of the warp before the Cadian Gate, they felt as if their very beings were under a barrage, their thoughts intertwining with the voices of the slain. For those who don't know, the Cadian Gate is the most stable route, and it's large enough to allow the passage of battle fleets into or out of the Eye of Terror. However, it's not easy to get in or get out of there because Imperial cordons surround it, guarding against the raids, horrors, and black crusades that sporadically issue forth from the Eye. With the correct clearance codes, the 7-ship war fleet of the Sabers slipped past several layers of that zone actually, eluding fortress planets and orbital sentinel stations, but those that are on guard are on constant alert, and they couldn't be avoided entirely. In their final run, they could not avoid a brief clash with an Imperial Fist's strike cruiser and supporting destroyer craft that had scrambled to block them. The opposing fleets exchanged distant fire, and the Crimson Sabers were forced to repel a very brief but fierce boarding action. This was not a battle he wished for, but with their heads filled with nightmare visions of slaughter, the Crimson Sabers reacted by rote, taking over as they simply fought off another enemy. With a single ship left behind, one ship was damaged, trailing debris, listing slightly. The Crimson Sabers at last left behind their pursuers and entered the most feared region of space in the galaxy, the Eye of Terror. They went on, making full speed. They knew that only war could drown out the voices in their heads. Only when their very armor dripped with gore would the voices stop. So it was they descended upon the Eye of Terror with unequaled fury of the righteous and the psychotically mad. They brought doom, and in their hands they carried death and carnage. The first to feel their wrath were the outermost planets, those only partially contained by the swirling maelstrom. These were not demon worlds fully, that bathed in the free-flowing powers of the warp, but rather the refuge of dispossessed, twisted home of mutants, and the most successful of cultists that actually managed to make a run for it. These planets made fine recruiting grounds and hidden lairs for renegade warbands of Space Marines. There, practical raiders formed small armies that would launch into the Imperium. Whoever they were, witch, human, mutant, renegade marine, all fell before the Crimson Sabers. Bolter and Chainsword unleashed retribution, fighting with a savage joy that for a time cleared their mind and soul. Planet by planet, they worked their way ever deeper into the Eye. They slaughtered their way through cultists with ease, but were slowed considerably when they ran up against Space Marine warbands. Through their own numbers, the power of their fleet, and the anger in their hearts, they pressed on. During one planetfall, they fought Khorne berserkers, toppling idols and gunning down cultists. On a beslined and marsh-ridden moon, they discovered the lair of creatures that walked like men, but had the heads of enormous insects. Some of them wore the power armor of some unrecognizable chapter. All were dispatched with the same ruthless efficiency. After each battle, the voices were silent, and the Crimson Sabers felt renewed and full of worthy purpose. But soon, the voices were back. During these wars, there was no single moment that marked their turning to chaos. Rather, it was a gradual evolution. The powers of the warp and the heightened fears and desires of each Space Marine combined to morph the Crimson Sabers. In some, the changes were internal or too subtle to be noticed. In others, the transmutation was far more drastic. Since the battle on Numidia, not all Crimson Sabers went along with or accepted the growing corruption of the chapter. A few of these individuals were struck down as they attempted to forestall or prevent the massacres. However, even when filled with the red joy of slaughter, the Crimson Sabers were loath to slay their brothers. In most cases, those who attempted to rein them in, or even those who protested too loudly afterwards, were seized and thrown into holding cells. One of the individuals thrown into those holding cells was Sevastus Cranon's true biological brother. Several more Sabers were clamped into irons after the rebellion against the growing mutations amongst their brethren. A former chaplain buckled as he realized a horrible new truth. He was actually starting to enjoy the slaughter, and he begged his comrades to put him out of his misery. Chained and isolated, without the mass murder to even temporarily shut out the voices, most of these unfortunates succumbed to raving insanity. The lower levels of the ships rang to the ravings of madmen, yet still the Sabers kept them incarcerated. The amount of raw warp energy in the real space area around the Eye of Terror means that time passes strangely there. What may seem a matter of days and weeks might be simply seconds outside. On and on the Crimson Sabers went, searching every new planet, moon, or space hulk. If life was found, it was assaulted, relentlessly pursued, and slain. To a man, demon, thing. To them, it felt as if their campaign had already lasted for years. In the beginning, the librarians diligently recorded the details of the wars. Or so they thought. All who approached the Eye increased the risk of madness or possession. And a psychic mind is an even greater risk. When the librarians went to check their data scrolls and chronologs, in an attempt to verify the length of this campaign, they found not the accounts of their several score of battles, but instead gibberish, ranting recordings of the maniacal voices from inside their heads. Cranon took that news hard. He'd hoped to redress the ledger against the Sabers by sending detailed records of their actions. In this way, the Imperium may learn something of their sacrifice for the chapter they had wronged. His deepest wish had been to prove their worth and gain forgiveness, but this was a fool's hope. Rightly or wrongly, they had been condemned by a harsh, unforgiving realm, and there was no going back. More realistically, he simply wished to redeem their honour, perhaps earning a worthy remembrance and memorial. Now, ironically, the only messages the Crimson Sabers had transmitted were garbled nonsense and lunatic ravings. Surely the exact thing that would convince the Imperium that they were indeed possessed and lost. Although the passage of time had become a befuddlement, he knew it was 3 days since their last battle. He knew it was only 3 days because already the voices were back in his head, scratching away, growing more and more aware of it in every passing hour. They had not been able to find enough foes on that planet to wash away the murmuring for long. He looked at himself and he looked at his army. By this point, he'd lost well over 200 Marines, and without a homeworld or neophytes, there were no replacements. There were another 50 or so he couldn't account for that hadn't been seen for days. At least one had reportedly burst out of his power armor, becoming a foul monstrosity that prowled the lower decks of his ship, the Red Honor. Whatever it was, it would have to be hunted out and contained. Cranon also suspected that many librarians had passed beyond unstable and teetered on the brink of some dreadful transformation. His own blood brother was locked in a cell, refusing to speak to him, calling him a murderous traitor. Even his fleet was mutating, Gothic spires twisting upwards and spiked railings jutting outwards. He was also fairly certain the corridor leading to the command bridge was now organic. At this point, at the low point of despair and utter failure, he decided he no longer wanted an unmourned martyrdom. Instead, he wanted to live. Cranon gathered a selection of his most trusted officers and those leaders of the Crimson Sabers who seemed to be coping best with the onset of their curse. Into that tight circle came Company Masters Rangald and Sherdon, Veteran Sergeant Drasnicht, along with former Chaplain Okrak and Master Librarian Manon. To them alone, Cranon revealed his new frame of mind. He stated he meant to find some way to end the curse and carve out a life rather than simply finding a way to end it with honour. In many ways, this was a final acceptance of their rebellion, intentional or not, from the Imperium. Where Cranon had half expected to find resentment, he found only a feeling of mutual relief. Each of the gathered leaders had also felt the pang of regret as they prepared to sacrifice their lives in battle. They were following Cranon out of duty and vows, aspects that had controlled their lives for many years, but now seemed hollow. Each of the officers expressed his own version, justifying they no longer sought to martyr themselves. For the cause they had quickly and erroneously judged them. None of them, not even Cranon, mentioned that the inner voices that tormented them had been spewing long diatribes along similar lines for some time now. It was as if each was steeling his mind, willing themselves to believe that the whispered words of enticement had washed over harmlessly, that their decisions were entirely their own. Thus began a new stage. as a growing circle of confidants began planning how best to bring the rest of the chapter along with them. They also agreed the best ways to deal with those who insisted upon remaining loyal to their pledges to the Imperium and Emperor. One way or another, the Crimson Sabers would be no more. Not until every aspect of the plot was ripe did Cranon give the command. The chapter had gone 10 days without battle before they were unleashed to maul a rabble enclave they discovered upon a space hulk. So vast was the craft it took 3 days to clear. As the Space Marines returned, they were immediately summoned once more into the Great Saber Hall upon Red Honor. There, squad by squad, company by company, they formed up, waiting for their brethren, waiting to hear their leader. Despite their armor and viscera that still dripped from their close combat weapons, each of them was content. Aboard the derelict vessel, a hulk named Lost Hope had been hundreds of dark pilgrims and worshippers of the dark gods, lured into the Eye of Terror with false promises of power. Their deaths had drowned out the voices, at least for the time being. Cranon addressed his brothers, asking them how long they had fought in the Eye. Once he had told the chapter they had been brave enough to follow him. Now he asked them to have the courage to follow him out. Cranon announced he no longer served the Imperium. Instead, he would seek a cure to halt the madness that had grown in his mind. The Sabers were dead, he told them, claiming the very name the Imperial agents had pinned upon them for their acts on Idria and Demetra. From now on, he would lead the Crimson Slaughter. What followed was brief but bloody. To some score of Space Marines, this was a final blow. They heard words of sedition and looked around them, seeing that which they had forsworn to destroy. Cranon's war council had already earmarked who the likely loyalists would be and stationed their own supporters nearby, guns already aimed. Less fought than expected, and the action was swiftly over. Once again their lives had changed forever. Another line had been crossed. Another decision had been taken from which there could be no turning back. So did the Crimson Slaughter step forward, and of their own free will choose to stride down the path of damnation. So ends the first part of our 40k stories for the Crimson Slaughter. When I started, I did not intend for this video to be 2 episodes long, but there is simply so much lore that I've decided to split it up. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video and leave any comments for suggestions, improvements, or just other theories down below. Also make sure to subscribe. I appreciate all subscriptions and I really hope that you'll be able to join us for future videos. So thank you very much for watching. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis and I'll see you all again.